The town looked peaceful from the outside. Small houses lined the narrow streets, children played in dusty yards, and the evening smelled of grilled food and fresh rain. But beneath that calm surface, everyone knew something was wrong. People had stopped trusting the police long ago. No one said it openly, but you could see it in their eyes when a patrol car passed by. Doors would quietly close and shopkeepers would look down, pretending to be busy. It wasn't always this way. Years ago, the police department had a good name. They helped people, solved disputes, and kept the peace. But things changed when a few officers realized that fear was more powerful than respect. Slowly, they started using their badge to get what they wanted. They took money from businesses under the table, favored those who could pay, and ignored real crimes. Complaints were filed, but nothing ever came of them. The same people stayed in charge, and anyone who spoke out soon regretted it. One rainy afternoon, a new face arrived in town. She stepped off a bus carrying a small suitcase and an umbrella that barely survived the wind. She looked calm, polite, and unbothered by the weather. Her name was Elena, and she had recently rented a small office space near the town square. The sign on her door read, "Consulting Services." No one knew what kind of consulting she did, but she often sat at her desk with stacks of papers, making quiet phone calls or typing notes on her laptop. At first, people didn't pay her much attention. She seemed like any other newcomer trying to settle in. But those who met her said she listened more than she spoke. She asked polite questions about the town, who managed what, how long people had lived there, and which officers were known by name. Sometimes she visited the police department for what she called administrative records, smiling warmly and thanking the staff every time. She never stayed too long, never pushed too hard, and always left with a pleasant goodbye. The officers thought she was harmless, maybe even naive. One of them, known for his arrogance, joked that she was probably writing a small-town novel. Another laughed and said, "As long as she minds her business, she's fine." What they didn't know was that Elena noticed everything, every whispered joke, every uncomfortable glance between officers, and every strange entry in public records that didn't quite add up. One night, after the town went quiet, Elena sat by her window with her laptop open. Her face glowed under the screen light as she typed a message. The words were short but direct, filled with numbers, dates, and names. When she finished, she encrypted the message and sent it through a secure federal server. Then she leaned back in her chair, looking out at the dark street below. A police car slowly passed, its red and blue lights flashing faintly against the window. She watched it disappear into the distance and whispered to herself, "Almost ready." For weeks, she blended into the rhythm of the town. She visited small stores, had coffee at the local diner, and occasionally joined community meetings. People started liking her calm nature. She never gossiped, never complained, and always treated everyone kindly. But underneath her soft-spoken appearance, she was carefully collecting threads, bank transactions, property records, and stories that matched what she already suspected. The more she learned, the more disturbing it became. There was a pattern in every report of resistance, every case that mysteriously disappeared before trial, and every promotion inside the department. It wasn't just a few bad officers, it was a full system built to protect itself. Even some lawyers avoided taking cases that involved the police, fearing backlash. One afternoon, while walking home from the grocery store, Elena saw a man standing outside a closed shop, arguing with two officers. The man's face was red with frustration, and one of the officers pushed him back lightly with a smirk. She didn't intervene, but she watched quietly from a distance. Later that night, she saw the same man's name appear on the arrest list, charged with public disturbance. She made a note in her journal and circled it twice. Days passed, and Elena's curiosity seemed harmless enough to those around her. The officers saw her as another polite woman who asked too many questions, but didn't pose a real threat. But what they didn't realize was that Elena wasn't just curious, she was methodical. Every visit, every question, every form she requested was part of a larger plan. One evening, she was sitting in her office when the power flickered. The street outside was nearly empty. She pulled a small recorder from her drawer and pressed play. The voice of an officer echoed through the small room, recorded from a conversation at the local diner. "Don't worry," he said on the tape. "We've got the chief on our side. As long as we handle things quietly, nothing will touch us." She replayed that line twice, wrote down the timestamp, and smiled faintly. "That's all I needed," she said softly. The next morning, Elena visited the town library. She spent hours going through old newspaper archives, scanning articles about local arrests and police activity from years ago. The pattern repeated itself. Citizens arrested for minor reasons, cases dropped suddenly, and officers promoted right after. She printed what she needed, slid the papers into a folder, and locked it in her briefcase. When she left the library, she saw two officers standing near her car. They nodded and smiled, but the way they watched her felt different this time. Less friendly, more suspicious. She returned their smile, unlocked her car calmly, and drove away without saying a word. That night, she sent another message through her encrypted channel. It contained everything she had gathered: recordings, documents, names, and dates. The reply came quickly this time. The message read only 3 words: "Proceed with caution." From that day on, Elena noticed small changes. A patrol car passed her house more often. Someone had gone through her mail, leaving the letters slightly out of order. Even the landlord mentioned that a couple of officers had asked about her rent details. But Elena didn't panic. She had been through worse in her career, and fear was something she had learned to use rather than avoid. A week later, she attended a town meeting about public safety. Several police officers were there, giving speeches about how they were keeping the streets safe. The crowd clapped politely, though many people didn't seem convinced. When the meeting ended, Elena approached one of the officers and thanked him for his service. Her tone was warm and sincere, but her eyes stayed steady, searching for any sign of guilt. The officer laughed awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. She could tell that he knew something was closing in. Late that night, as rain poured over the streets, Elena packed her briefcase again. She included printed copies of every piece of evidence she had collected. Then she looked at the clock. It was past midnight. She opened her secure laptop one more time, typed a short update, and ended it with a single line. Operation nearly complete. Final observation in progress. The next morning, she walked into the police department with her usual friendly smile. She greeted the front desk clerk and asked for some public records. As the clerk printed the papers, one of the officers leaned on the counter beside her and joked, "You sure like your paperwork." Elena smiled politely. "I do. It helps me understand how things really work around here." The officer laughed but looked uneasy. She could tell he didn't like her calm confidence. He didn't know who she really was or how much she already knew. Later that day, she met the local baker, who whispered that another shop owner had been taken away the night before. The reason? Disrespecting an officer. Elena's heart sank, not because she was surprised, but because it proved her theory right. The department had grown bold enough to act without fear. They believed no one could stop them. That night, Elena walked down to the riverbank where the water reflected the dim streetlights. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the people who had been hurt, silenced, or scared into obedience. She knew that what she was about to do would change everything for this town. But she also knew that it would expose her. Once she moved forward, there would be no turning back. A cold breeze brushed her hair as she whispered to herself, "They've celebrated long enough. Time for the truth to speak." When she returned home, she sealed one last envelope, addressed not to anyone in town but to a federal office hundreds of miles away. She placed the evidence inside, stamped it with the official insignia she had kept hidden in her desk, and dropped it in the mailbox. The following morning, the town woke up as usual. People went to work, kids went to school, and the same officers patrolled the same streets. But something unseen had already shifted. The first signs would appear soon. A phone call here, a document requested there, a quiet audit no one expected. And while the officers continued their daily routine, joking and laughing as always, Elena sat quietly in her office, sipping coffee and watching the rain slide down the window. She looked calm, even peaceful, but behind her still eyes a storm was building. The pieces were all in place. The only thing left now was to let them move. And when they did, the truth would finally come out in the most unexpected way. The following week began like any other. The streets were busy with people heading to work, shops opening, and cars honking at the usual intersections. The police cars moved slowly along the main road, sirens off, but their presence always carried a sense of unease. People spoke in low voices when they passed by, Everyone had grown used to keeping opinions too. Elena walked down the same streets with her notebook tucked under her arm. She smiled politely at everyone she met. To most people, she looked like an ordinary woman doing ordinary things. But inside her calm expression, she was watching everything. The tension in the air, the way people avoided eye contact when an officer appeared, and the quiet frustration that lived behind every forced smile. That morning, something happened that caught her attention. A small grocery store owner, Mr. Daniels, was arguing with two officers outside his shop. Elena slowed down but kept her distance, pretending to look at her phone while her ears caught every word. "Sir, it's a simple request," one of the officers said, crossing his arms. "You know how things work around here. Everyone contributes." Mr. Daniels shook his head, clearly upset. "I already pay taxes like everyone else. I'm not giving another cent. My business barely survives as it is." The officer's tone turned sharper. "Then maybe your shop needs another inspection. We can always find something wrong." Elena felt a quiet anger rise inside her. She knew exactly what inspection meant in this town. It was a polite word for punishment. The officers often used fake violations to scare people into paying them. But Elena didn't step in, not yet. She had learned that timing was everything. Instead, she made a quick note in her notebook and continued walking, pretending not to notice. The next day, the same shop was closed. A paper was taped to the glass door that said, "Temporarily closed, ongoing investigation." Rumors spread that Mr. Daniels had been taken to the station after resisting arrest. People whispered about it, but no one dared to ask questions openly. They had seen too many others get in trouble for less. Elena couldn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk listening to the ticking clock on the wall. She replayed the moment in her mind, the fear in Mr. Daniels' voice, the arrogance of the officers, and the silence of everyone around. She knew that what had just happened wasn't random. It was part of a pattern she had been tracking for months. The next morning, she went to the courthouse. The building looked old, its walls cracked with age, but it carried an air of importance. People walked in and out quickly, most of them avoiding eye contact with the guards at the door. Elena entered quietly, went through the metal detector, and made her way to the records office. The clerk behind the counter recognized her. "Oh, you again," he said with a polite smile. "Looking for more files?" "Yes," she said softly. "The arrest report for Mr. Daniels. He runs the grocery on Pine Street." The clerk hesitated for a moment before pulling out a folder. "You didn't hear this from me," he whispered, "but something about this case feels strange. They booked him late at night and the paperwork came in hours later, signed by someone who wasn't even on duty." Elena nodded, pretending to be surprised. "That's unusual." "Very," the clerk said quietly. "But I guess that's how things work now." Elena thanked him, took the file, and left. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she walked to a nearby cafe, ordered a cup of tea, and sat by the window. Only after the waiter left did she open the folder. Inside were photographs, reports, and a short statement claiming that Mr. Daniels had physically resisted lawful orders. But as Elena read further, she noticed inconsistencies. The officer's report had missing timestamps. The signatures didn't match, and there were no camera recordings attached. She sighed and closed the folder. She knew this was her turning point. Quiet observation wasn't enough anymore. It was time to bring light to what was happening. But she also knew that one wrong step could ruin everything. Later that evening, she visited the town's small law office. The lawyer on duty looked tired and overworked. Elena sat across from him and gently brought up the case. "Would you consider defending him?" she asked. The lawyer sighed. "I wish I could," he said, glancing at the door nervously. "But I've learned it's better to stay out of things involving the department. Cases like that never end well." Elena studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "I understand," she said softly. She left the office, but inside she felt even more determined. If no one else was willing to help, she would. That night she wrote a long report, carefully listing each incident she had documented since arriving in town. She included dates, evidence, and summaries of conversations she had overheard. Then she attached the files and sent them through a secure federal system. When she hit send, a small message appeared on the screen. "Data received. Review in progress." The next morning, word spread quickly that Mr. Daniels's case would go to court. The news surprised everyone. Usually, these cases disappeared before they reached that point. People whispered that maybe this time would be different, but few believed it. The officers, on the other hand, looked relaxed and confident. They had seen this play out too many times to worry. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was unusually crowded. People gathered outside, whispering and waiting to see what would happen. Inside, the officers laughed and joked with each other, their uniforms freshly pressed, their smiles full of arrogance. They believed it would be a routine trial, one more victory for them, another humiliation for an innocent man. Elena entered quietly, sitting near the back. She wore a simple gray coat and carried a folder under her arm. She didn't draw attention to herself, but a few people recognized her as the polite woman who often asked questions around town. The judge arrived, and the courtroom settled into silence. Mr. Daniels was brought in, looking tired but calm. His hands trembled slightly as he sat beside his court-appointed lawyer. The officers leaned back in their chairs, whispering to each other with smug smiles. The prosecutor began reading the charges, describing Mr. Daniels as uncooperative and disruptive. Elena watched the officers' faces carefully. They seemed too comfortable, too sure of themselves. She could tell they weren't afraid of losing. They already knew how this would end, but she also knew something they didn't. As the hearing continued, Elena noticed a court clerk walking toward the judge's bench with a sealed envelope. It bore an unfamiliar mark, federal authorization. The judge opened it quietly, reading the contents without showing any emotion. The officers didn't notice. They were too busy congratulating each other with quiet smirks. A few moments later, the judge looked up and cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said, "I've received new information regarding this case." The courtroom went silent. Mr. Daniels' lawyer looked confused. Even the officers stopped whispering. Elena remained still, her eyes fixed on the judge. She knew exactly what was happening. The message she had sent days earlier had reached the right hands. The judge glanced toward the back of the courtroom, his gaze settling on Elena. "I would like to request that Ms. Elena come forward," he said. The officers exchanged puzzled looks. One of them muttered under his breath, "What's she got to do with this?" Elena stood up slowly, holding her folder close to her chest. Every step she took echoed through the room. People turned their heads, curious, sensing that something important was about to happen. She stopped in front of the judge's bench and waited quietly. "Ms. Elena," the judge said, "based on your position within the Federal Department of Internal Affairs, you are authorized to present your findings to this court." The room fell into total silence. The officers' expressions changed instantly, from confusion to shock, then to fear. Elena nodded calmly. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly. She placed the folder on the desk and opened it. "Over the past several months," she began, "I have been investigating multiple reports of misconduct and corruption within this department. The case of Mr. Daniels is not an isolated incident. It is part of a long-standing pattern of abuse." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The officers tried to speak, but the judge raised his hand. "You will have your chance to respond," he said firmly. Elena continued, her tone even and steady. "I have gathered evidence of falsified reports, unauthorized financial transactions, and direct threats made against citizens. Every detail in this folder has been verified and submitted to the federal office for review." When she finished, the courtroom was silent again. The officers sat frozen, realizing their celebration had ended before it even began. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Elena carefully. "We will review these documents immediately," he said. "Until further notice, the court will be adjourned." As the gavel struck, the officers stood slowly, their faces pale. They had no idea that the woman they once laughed at, the quiet, polite stranger who asked too many questions, was the very person sent to bring them down. Outside, the crowd buzzed with confusion. Reporters who had come expecting a routine case whispered excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Elena walked past them without a word. She didn't need attention or praise. Her focus was on the next step, the investigation that would finally reveal the full truth. That night, as the rain returned and thunder rolled in the distance, Elena sat at her desk once again. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dim room. She opened a new document and began typing her final report. Her hands didn't shake and her heart was calm. She knew this was only the beginning. The town would soon see justice, and the officers who once felt untouchable were about to learn that power built on fear never lasts forever. The morning after the hearing, the town was buzzing with rumors. Some said the court had been interrupted by someone from the government. Others claimed that the local officers were under federal watch. No one knew the full truth, but everyone could feel that something big had shifted. At the police station, the mood was heavy. The laughter that usually echoed through the hallways was gone. The officers avoided eye contact with one another. They had built their confidence on control and fear, but now doubt had crept in. Whispers followed them wherever they went. Someone would lower their voice every time the name Elena was mentioned. Elena herself stayed quiet. After leaving the courthouse, she had gone home, avoiding all interviews and phone calls. She knew that silence was often more powerful than speaking. The less they knew about her next move, the more uneasy they became. The following day, she walked into her office as usual. Her assistant, a kind older woman who helped her with local records, looked worried. "You've started something, haven't you?" she asked gently. Elena smiled faintly. "Something that should have started years ago," she said. She spent the rest of the morning going through stacks of documents. Every page told another story of people mistreated, cases closed too quickly, and reports changed after being signed. She highlighted key names and events, building a timeline that stretched back almost 10 years. As she worked, she could hear the faint hum of life outside. Cars passing, people talking, the world carrying on as if everything was normal. But she knew better. The calm before truth is always the loudest silence. Later that day, she received a call. The voice on the other end spoke firmly but respectfully. "This is the Federal Department of Internal Affairs. Your initial report has been reviewed. Field agents will arrive tomorrow morning. Please ensure the documents are ready for submission." Elena took a deep breath. "Understood," she said. She hung up, sat back in her chair, and stared at the wall for a long time. Tomorrow was the day everything would begin to unravel. That night, the town streets were quieter than usual. The police cars still moved around, but slower, almost hesitant. Some officers tried to act normal, pretending they weren't worried, but anyone could see the tension in their faces. The usual arrogance had turned into unease. Inside the small cafe near the courthouse, 2 officers sat at a corner table. They spoke in low voices, leaning close so no one could overhear. "She's not just some consultant," one of them said. "The judge called her a federal director." The other one shook his head. "That can't be true. We'd have known if someone like that was here." "You think so?" the first officer replied. "She's been in town for months. Always quiet, always watching. And now suddenly the feds show up right after she speaks in court? That's not a coincidence." They both fell silent. The sound of clinking cups and low chatter filled the space around them. They knew the walls were closing in. They just didn't know how much time they had left. The next morning, just after sunrise, 3 unmarked black cars pulled up outside the courthouse. The doors opened, and several federal agents stepped out. They wore plain clothes but carried an air of quiet authority. People passing by stopped and stared, whispering among themselves. The officers inside the station noticed too. Within an hour, the courthouse filled with movement. Files were requested, computers were inspected, and conversations turned into formal interviews. For the first time in years, the police department couldn't control the narrative. They had always been the ones asking questions, but now they were the ones being questioned. Elena arrived shortly after, carrying a large folder under her arm. She greeted the agents calmly, showing her identification before entering the secured room. Inside, she laid out everything she had collected, the recordings, reports, and handwritten notes that revealed the network of corruption. One of the agents, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes, listened carefully. "You've done excellent work," he said. "It's rare to see an investigation this complete before we even step in." Elena nodded. "They made it easy by thinking no one would ever look closely." The agent smiled faintly. "They usually do." For hours, the team went through the evidence. Names were matched, documents verified, and timelines built. It became clear that the corruption reached deeper than anyone had expected. Some local officials had been helping cover up complaints, while others looked away out of fear. Meanwhile, word spread through town that the police station was under federal audit. People who once avoided talking about their experiences began to come forward. Shop owners, former employees, and even a few retired officers began sharing what they knew. It was as if years of silence had finally cracked open. One of the residents, an elderly man who had lost his business years ago after refusing to pay extra fees, came to see Elena. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," he said. his eyes watery with relief. "You gave us hope again." Elena smiled kindly. "You gave me the reason to keep going," she said. Back at the police station, panic started to show. Officers who once walked with confidence now avoided public spaces. Some started making phone calls late at night, hoping to protect themselves, but it was too late. The investigation was already bigger than any one person. A few days later, the agents called for a closed meeting at the courthouse. The judge, the local prosecutor, and Elena were all present. The lead agent placed a thick folder on the table. "We've confirmed misuse of authority, falsified reports, and illegal financial transactions," he said. "We will be making several arrests." The judge looked serious but relieved. "It's about time," he said quietly. The prosecutor, who had once turned a blind eye, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew his silence had allowed this to grow. He looked at Elena and said, "You've done what none of us had the courage to do." Elena replied softly, "Sometimes courage just means doing what's right, even when you're afraid." That afternoon, as the sun set behind the courthouse, the town square filled with people waiting for news. They didn't know exactly what was happening inside, but they could feel that something was changing. The same police cars that had once made them anxious now passed by quietly, unsure of how much longer they would be on the streets. Inside the courthouse, Elena stood by the window, watching as people gathered outside. She could see hope returning to their faces little by little. It wasn't celebration yet, but it was something close to it, a quiet belief that justice might finally come. One of the agents approached her. "You know," he said, "cases like this usually take years." "You did it in months," Elena smiled faintly. "When people suffer for too long, time has a way of speeding up when truth starts to move." The agent nodded. "We'll be making the arrest tomorrow morning. Would you like to be there?" Elena hesitated for a moment, then said, "No. My part is done. Let the truth speak for itself." The next morning, the town woke to the sound of sirens, but not the usual kind. These were federal vehicles moving with precision. People stepped out of their homes, peering down the street as officers in plain clothes escorted several local policemen out of the station. No shouting, no chaos, just the calm, quiet end of a long-running lie. By noon, everyone in town knew. The so-called untouchable officers were gone. The chief, who had been at the top of it all, was taken away quietly, his face pale and unreadable. Reporters arrived, asking questions that no one could answer yet. Elena watched from her office window as the cars drove away. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Justice was never about revenge for her. It was about restoring balance. That evening, she packed her belongings slowly. The investigation had reached its end, at least for now. She closed the last folder, tied it neatly, and placed it in her briefcase. Before turning off the lights, she looked around the office that had been her quiet base for months. It looked ordinary. Nothing about it showed the weight of what had just happened. As she locked the door, a few townspeople standing nearby approached her. One of them, a young woman who worked at the post office, said, "We didn't know who you really were, but thank you for everything you did." Elena gave a warm, humble smile. "You don't need to thank me. Just take care of each other now. That's how change lasts." She walked down the street toward the bus stop. The evening sun cast a golden glow over the quiet town. The same streets that once felt heavy now seemed lighter, freer. For the first time in years, people walked without looking over their shoulders. As she waited for the bus, Elena glanced back one last time. The courthouse stood tall in the distance, glowing in the sunset. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, and not every problem would disappear overnight. But what mattered most was that truth had finally found its voice. When the bus arrived, she stepped on, found a window seat, and sat quietly. The town faded into the distance as the bus moved along the highway. She watched the horizon, calm and thoughtful. There was no celebration, no applause, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what she came to do. Somewhere deep inside, she whispered to herself, "Justice doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just arrives quietly and stays." And with that, Elena leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the road carry her toward whatever came next. The courtroom was silent as the morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, painting thin golden lines across the polished floor. Everyone was waiting for the judge to arrive. The officers, seated confidently at the defense table, looked calm and collected. Their uniforms were pressed, their badges gleaming, and their expressions proud. They whispered to each other, sharing quiet laughs as if they already knew how the day would end. They had seen this before. The same courtroom, the same type of case, the same powerless citizens trying to fight the same system that always sided with authority. Nothing ever changed here, and they were sure today would be no different. Mr. Daniels sat quietly near the front, his eyes lowered. His lawyer looked nervous, flipping through papers as if the answers to justice were hidden somewhere between the lines. Elena sat a few rows behind them, still and composed, her hands resting on her lap. She wore a plain dark suit, her expression unreadable. She looked like any ordinary woman who had come to watch a case, but there was a calm sharpness in her eyes that most people wouldn't notice. The bailiff announced the judge's arrival. Everyone stood, the room filled with the sound of chairs moving and shoes shuffling against the floor. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, took his seat and opened the file before him. The sound of pages turning echoed softly in the room. The prosecutor began speaking, going through the familiar motions. He described the arrest, the charges, and the supposed resistance. He painted the picture of Mr. Daniels as an uncooperative shop owner who had caused trouble. The corrupt officers nodded subtly, their smirks barely hidden. One of them even leaned back in his chair, glancing at Elena with a smug smile as if to say, "See? We told you. Nothing changes." Elena didn't react. She simply watched. Her calmness was unsettling in its own way, and a few people noticed it. The judge continued listening, occasionally making notes. The case was moving just as the officers had expected. Everything was going according to plan, or so they thought. Then something unexpected happened. A court clerk entered the room holding a sealed envelope. He walked straight to the judge and handed it to him without saying a word. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised, and looked at the seal before opening it. It wasn't ordinary. The envelope carried the bold, unmistakable stamp of a federal department. The judge read the contents quietly. The more he read, the more his expression changed. The casual boredom vanished. He adjusted his glasses, looked up, and stared across the courtroom. The silence grew heavy. Even the officers stopped whispering. They could sense something wasn't right. Finally, the judge looked toward the back of the room and said, "Miss Elena, please approach the front." All heads turned at once. The officers looked at each other in confusion. One of them whispered, "Why is he calling her?" Another shrugged, trying to hide his unease. Elena rose slowly, every movement deliberate and calm. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked down the aisle. She stood before the judge, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The judge gave her a respectful nod. "Ms. Elena," he said, "as per your position within the Federal Department of Internal Affairs, you are permitted to address this court." The courtroom went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The officers froze, their smiles fading instantly. One of them leaned forward, whispering harshly to his lawyer. "What did he just say?" The lawyer looked pale and confused. Elena turned slightly, facing the courtroom. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm tone carried effortlessly through the silence. "Your Honor," she said softly, "this hearing is connected to an ongoing federal investigation. The individuals sitting at the defense table are not only defendants in this local case, but also subjects of multiple federal charges related to abuse of power, falsified reports, and obstruction of justice." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The officers tried to keep straight faces, but their confidence was crumbling. The lead officer shifted in his seat, gripping the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She's lying." Elena didn't flinch. She opened the folder she had brought with her and handed a stack of papers to the judge. "All evidence has been verified and authenticated by federal authorities," she continued. "We have documented recordings, witness statements, and communication logs linking these officers to multiple incidents of misconduct and illegal coordination." The judge skimmed through the first few pages, his eyes widening slightly. He looked up and his voice took on a serious tone. "Is the federal department aware that this court session was scheduled today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elena said calmly. "In fact, we arranged it this way. We wanted to ensure that their actions would be addressed in full view of the public." Gasps filled the room. Even Mr. Daniels' lawyer stared in disbelief. The officers began whispering frantically among themselves. The lead officer tried to stand up, his face red. "This is out of line. You can't just walk in here and—" But before he could finish, the courtroom doors opened again. 2 federal marshals entered quietly, their badges gleaming. The sound of their boots echoed as they approached the defense table. The officers' faces turned pale. The lead officer's voice faltered. "Wait, what's going on here?" The judge banged his gavel once. "Order in the court." He turned to the marshals and nodded. "Proceed." Elena stepped back slightly as the marshals approached. The lead officer's confidence vanished completely as one of the marshals leaned down and said, "You're under federal arrest." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Some people stood up, unable to believe what they were seeing. The officers who had once laughed at others were now the ones being handcuffed, right in front of everyone. Elena watched quietly, her face calm but serious. She didn't gloat or smile. She simply observed as justice finally began to unfold. The judge looked at her again. "Ms. Elena, would you like to make a formal statement for the record?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Turning slightly toward the crowd, she said, "For years this community has been living under fear created by those who swore to protect it. Many voices went unheard, many truths buried, but justice doesn't vanish, it waits, and when the time comes, it speaks louder than anyone expects." The room fell silent again. There was no dramatic music, no shouting, just the quiet weight of truth filling every corner. Mr. Daniels sat in disbelief, his eyes glistening. For the first time in months, he felt seen. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, whispering something softly. The townspeople who had come to watch looked at each other with wide eyes. Outside, news crews had already gathered, alerted by whispers of a surprise development. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control. By the time the officers were escorted out of the courtroom, reporters were shouting questions, cameras flashing. Elena exited the courtroom last. She paused near the doorway for a moment, watching the chaos unfold. Then she turned to the judge, gave a polite nod, and quietly walked out. As she stepped outside, the cold air brushed against her face. She took a deep breath, the tension of months finally beginning to lift. The officers were being led into waiting federal vehicles, their once proud faces now filled with disbelief and fear. One of them turned toward her as he was pushed into a car. "You set us up," he said through clenched teeth. Elena met his eyes briefly and replied softly, "No. You set yourselves up when you forgot what your badge was for." With that, she turned and walked away, blending into the growing crowd of reporters and onlookers. She didn't wait for recognition or praise. Her job wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure the truth couldn't be hidden any longer. Back inside, the judge officially closed the hearing, announcing that all local charges would be dismissed in light of the federal intervention. Mr. Daniels' name was cleared within minutes. He walked out of the courtroom with tears in his eyes, not from sadness but from relief. People who had once been afraid of speaking up were already whispering among themselves, realizing they weren't alone anymore. For the first time in years, hope had entered the courthouse instead of fear. That night, the town buzzed with talk. News channels replayed the footage of the arrests, calling it one of the most unexpected turnarounds in recent memory. But Elena wasn't on any of those broadcasts. She stayed silent, keeping her role private, her face calm and distant as always. While others celebrated, she sat in her quiet hotel room, writing her final report for the department. She didn't see herself as a hero. She was just someone doing what needed to be done, someone who believed that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. Outside, the lights of the town glowed softly against the dark sky. Tomorrow things would begin to change. And Elena knew that somewhere in another quiet corner of the country, another case would soon need her attention. The sun rose slowly over the town, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, people woke up feeling something different, something lighter. The air didn't feel as heavy, and there was a quiet sense of relief spreading through every street, every home, and every small business that had once lived in fear. The news had already spread across the country. What started as a small court hearing in a forgotten town had turned into a national story about justice finally catching up to those who had hidden behind badges and lies. Inside the police department, the atmosphere had completely changed. Desks that were once full of laughter and arrogance now sat empty. The sound of boots echoing in the hallways was replaced by the quiet shuffle of federal investigators sorting through files. Every drawer, every document, every computer was being checked. Officers who had nothing to hide were nervous anyway. They spoke in whispers, unsure of who could be trusted anymore. At the center of all this was Elena. She arrived early that morning, her coat buttoned neatly, her face calm as always. She didn't act like someone who had just exposed a web of corruption. There was no pride, no excitement, just focus. She met with the lead federal investigator, who had come from the Capitol overnight. They went over final details, reviewed evidence, and discussed what would happen next for the department. As they walked through the quiet hallways, Elena noticed the faces of ordinary officers, those who had simply tried to do their jobs while living under the shadow of corruption. Some of them looked at her with gratitude. Others looked away, embarrassed that they had stayed silent for so long. Elena didn't judge them. She knew fear could silence good people, especially when power was misused. Outside, people began gathering near the courthouse. Reporters, photographers, and curious residents stood together, waiting for the official announcement. The federal team had promised to release a statement about the investigation, and everyone wanted to hear it firsthand. Among the crowd, Mr. Daniels stood quietly, holding a small envelope in his hand. Inside was the official document clearing his name completely. For him, it wasn't just about the charges being dropped. It was about getting his dignity back. When Elena stepped out of the building, a few reporters recognized her and immediately rushed forward. "Ma'am, are you the one who led the investigation? Can you tell us what happens now? What made you decide to get involved?" She paused, her calm eyes scanning the crowd. For a brief moment, the noise around her faded. Then she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "This wasn't about me," she said. "It was about justice, for everyone who was afraid to speak up and for those who tried to do the right thing but were silenced. Corruption doesn't just destroy systems, it destroys trust. Today is about restoring that trust." Her words were short but powerful. The reporters nodded, scribbling down every sentence. Cameras clicked rapidly. But before anyone could ask more questions, Elena turned and walked toward the government vehicle waiting for her. She didn't stay for the press conference or the interviews that followed. She had already done what she came to do. As the day went on, the town began to see changes. The acting police chief, a quiet man who had always kept his distance from the corrupt officers, gave a heartfelt speech in front of the department. He promised transparency, accountability, and open communication with the community. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but it was honest. People clapped. For the first time, they believed him. Inside local shops, people couldn't stop talking about what had happened. At the small cafe near the courthouse, customers sat at every table, replaying the events of the previous day like a movie. One man said, "I saw it with my own eyes." Those officers looked like they couldn't believe it. They thought they were untouchable. Another replied, "That woman, Elena, was it? She didn't even raise her voice. She just stood there and told the truth. That's real power." Across town, Mr. Daniels reopened his shop. The closed sign that had hung on his door for weeks was finally replaced with one that said, "Open." Customers came by not just to buy things, but to congratulate him. He smiled humbly, shaking hands and thanking people for their support. In a corner of the shop, he kept a small newspaper clipping with the headline, "Corrupt Officers Exposed in Federal Investigation." It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the truth forever. Meanwhile, in a quiet government office hundreds of miles away, Elena sat at her desk writing her final report. The office was small but neat, with stacks of documents and a single framed photo of a mountain landscape on the wall. Her report detailed every step of the investigation, from the first suspicion to the courtroom reveal. Her handwriting was neat and precise, her tone factual but not cold. When she reached the end, she paused for a long moment before writing the final line. Case concluded. Justice served. Community restored. She closed the file, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window. Outside, the city was alive with the sound of traffic and distant voices. She thought about the town she had left behind, the faces she had seen, the fear she had felt in people's voices, and the relief that followed once the truth came out. She wasn't someone who believed in heroes or glory. For her, justice wasn't about being celebrated. It was about balance, restoring what had been broken. That evening, she received a call from her department director. His voice carried pride and warmth. "You did good work out there, Elena," he said. The case made a bigger impact than we expected. You didn't just fix a department. You reminded people that the system can still work when the right people care enough to fight for it. Elena smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "But there's still more work to do." "There always is," he chuckled softly. "I suppose that's true. Rest for a few days, though. You've earned it." After hanging up, Elena stood by the window for a while, watching the city lights shimmer. She thought about all the people who would finally sleep peacefully that night, free from fear. Somewhere out there, a little boy would no longer have to watch his father get harassed. A small business owner would no longer have to pay for protection that should have been free. A town that once whispered about injustice could finally speak loudly about hope. The next morning, she packed her small suitcase and prepared to leave for her next assignment. She worked quietly, moving with the same calm precision she always had. Before she left, she took one last look around the room, then closed the door gently behind her. Weeks later, the town continued to heal. The new police leadership set up regular meetings with residents to rebuild trust. People started volunteering again, opening businesses and organizing community events. Schools taught students about honesty and standing up for what's right. The same courthouse where corruption had once ruled became a symbol of fairness. One evening, Mr. Daniels was closing his shop when he found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a short note written in neat handwriting. It said, "Keep believing in the truth. It's what keeps the world balanced." He smiled, folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer next to his business license. It reminded him that even when life felt unfair, there were people out there fighting quietly for justice. People like Elena. People who didn't need attention or fame to make a difference. As months passed, the story of what happened in that small town continued to inspire others. News programs and documentaries talked about it, calling it a rare example of courage and integrity. But for the people who lived there, it wasn't just a story, it was a turning point. The day the corrupt officers celebrated in court, thinking they had won, was the same day their world fell apart. And the woman they thought was just an ordinary face in the crowd turned out to be the one holding the key to everything. Sometimes justice doesn't come with noise or anger. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by someone who simply refuses to look away. Elena was that person. A quiet storm that changed everything without ever needing to shout. And though she had moved on to another place, another mission, the town would never forget her. Every time someone walked past the courthouse or saw a police car on patrol, they remembered that day. The day truth stood taller than power. The day justice walked in wearing calm eyes and a steady heart. And even years later, when new people came to live there and asked about the story, the old shopkeeper would smile and say, "It's true. I saw it myself." Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who knows the truth and isn't afraid to show it. Then he'd pause, look out the window and add quietly, "That woman reminded us of something we'd forgotten for a long time. That justice may sleep, but it never dies. And somewhere far away, maybe in another small town facing its own darkness, Elena would be walking quietly down another street, ready to bring the light again.